Rolling. Hello, everyone. I'm Russell Wood, Executive Director of the Alabama Nursery and Landscape Association and Gulf States Horticultural Expo. Normally, we would be wrapping up the expo around this time, but these days are proving to be anything but normal. The board of directors felt like it was important to still provide an update to our members, so we've got two gentlemen with us today. They're going to provide an update on legislative affairs in D.C. and also an economic outlook for the industry in 2021. So first is going to be Craig Regelbrugge with AmericanHort. He serves as their Senior Vice President, where he leads a team responsible for public policy, industry advocacy, and research programs. Regelbrugge serves in national leadership positions, representing the horticulture industry on matters relating to the labor force, immigration reform, plant health and production, and trade. With over 30 years of service as an association professional representing horticulture, he is a well-known resource in both the industry and Washington, D.C. Craig, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Russell. Hello, folks. It's great to be with you. Face-to-face would, of course, be better. Virtual is what we're doing. We all understand why. But before I get into the heart of my presentation, I guess I first of all have to say congratulations on the game. I have some headquarters office folks up in Ohio, and they're all kind of glum today. The staff meeting was pretty low-key, but their loss is your gain, so congrats on that. Secondly, Charlie and I do this state of the industry thing pretty often in various forms and formats, and sometimes he goes first, sometimes I go first, sometimes he goes long, sometimes I go long, sometimes I go high. Oop, never mind. But this time I'm going to go first, but I'm also probably going to yield more of my time to the good professor down at Texas A&M because I think he's got a longer narrative about the economy stuff that's going on right now. I also really can't jump in with both feet without thanking the Alabama Nursery and Landscape Association, the leadership, and particularly my friend and colleague Russell, who is a tremendous collaborator. We do a lot of good and important work together. And plus, he probably has the most inspirational Corona beard in the entire Nursery and Landscape Industry Association executive community. So I couldn't grow one if I tried, so I'm no competition. There's a few people trying, but Russell's got it. So with that, I'm going to try to go ahead and show my screen. Okay, there we are. And gonna really just jump in with, you don't want to look back for very long. However, hindsight is 2020, and 2020 thankfully is hindsight. So I just did want to, just acknowledge the fact that about this time last year, we were starting to get a little bit nervous that we were heading toward the throes of a pandemic. And indeed, by I believe it was the 13th of March, we had a national emergency declared. Obviously, parts of the country were well into spring, I think Bama included. And everybody was concerned about the horticultural market seizing up, about key market channels seizing up. In hindsight, there was some seizing up, and there were some people that experienced severe losses in particular channels and in particular parts of the season. But it depended a lot on what you do. It depended a lot on where you are, and it depended a lot on how your products and services move through the market channel. People were affected, others very much so. This became our focus, and in late March, early April, mid-April, and beyond, we were working very hard to make the case that our industry constituted critical infrastructure and our growers were essential workers, and basically give businesses who were able to protect their employees and their consumers adequately with the best guidelines at the time to be able to at least operate. We won a whole lot more battles than we lost. And I think, the South as a general matter was a more friendly place for businesses to be operating and for the critical infrastructure recognition than were some of the more northern states, Great Lakes and Northeast particularly. We also had to learn a whole bunch of acronyms. I've listed a few here. The really important ones, I think, in hindsight for our industry were especially Paycheck Protection Program, which has just been sort of extended in the most recent COVID relief package that Congress did, different strings attached, but it was an important safety net and industry early on. the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. A real other important one, though, was the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. And without going deep into it, we as an industry mobilized to make our case that we should have access to the same safety net that other types of agricultural producers, I'm talking about nursery and greenhouse producers, would be treated on an equal basis with other types of agricultural producers. It took a while. USDA doesn't understand our industry quite the same as they understand corn and soybeans and some of the livestock commodities, but we made our case and we ultimately were granted eligibility, and then in a second wave of the program, CFAP2, even broader eligibility, and a lot of folks benefited tremendously from the recovery assistance there. One other big success for 2020 that I've just got to briefly mention, we've been working on this for several years, but we are widely recognized as a branch of agriculture, nursery and greenhouse production, but within the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, the trucking regulatory agency, under their regulations, hours of service regulations, they sort of didn't agree with that. They did not see us as part of agriculture. They had a very vague, fuzzy, confusing definition of ag commodity, and it was potentially leading to problems from a compliance perspective. We wanted to be under the ag umbrella because that which happens within 150 miles of the source, the place of production, in essence, is outside of the drive time and load time and so forth counting. And so that was a huge, huge issue, and we ultimately won that battle. Late in the year, new regulations came out squarely recognizing branches of production horticulture as agriculture. So those are some big battles that we won as we move into the new season. Okay, folks, so this is the piece that's a little bit tough, but I have to spend a couple of minutes on it just because what happened almost a week ago, what happened on the 6th of January is going to shape the environment, political and policy, in which we're operating for some time to come. There are those who are choosing to call it 12/37/2020 because what unfolded on the afternoon of January 6th really fits better in the context of the year from hell that we had in 2020, and everybody's looking forward to a better 2021. So we'll call it, if you prefer, 12/37/2020. But there's no denying, folks, what unfolded. To state it bluntly, a sitting president of the United States stoked the passions of a crowd, which then marched to the US Capitol and sacked the legislative branch of government as it was in a joint meeting in the Capitol. We can have a lot of conversations around the rest of it, but that's at the heart of the issue. What happened? It left 5 people dead, including 2 Capitol policemen. Those of us who work in Washington know a lot of people who feel that they narrowly escaped without direct physical harm. Not since 1814, when the British sacked the Capitol, have we seen a breach of the Capitol security like we saw on the 6th of January. I was reading a little bit of history. I understand that there was a little bit of a scuffle with the British down in Mobile Bay at a point in time anyway, but it was in the hands of the Spanish at the time, so I don't think we need to necessarily too many parallels there. But all this said, I mean, clearly this was an epic failure of law enforcement. And I believe it's done significant and lasting damage, and it's going to take us a while as a nation to move beyond that damage. And I think it's going to take us all pulling together. It's going to take our politicians being statesmen, and it's going to take our citizens being good citizens and calling for accountability and calling for ultimately reconciliation and unification and moving forward. I'll end on an optimistic note down in a couple of points in my presentation, but I think we got a bit of a tough journey ahead. The final thing I want to say before I jump into the policy stuff, I'm going to steal Charlie's thunder here. And Charlie's he's ruffled a feather or two saying this. So I'll ruffle a feather or two saying it for him. and then you can give him all the flack if you don't like the message. But in all seriousness, Charlie has pointed out that every day he reads 22, maybe it's 25 now, economics blogs, because he feels it's essential to see how people who think differently and approach the questions of the day with a different perspective, how they see it. And that all gets stirred in around in that handsome bald head of his. And ultimately out comes some refined wisdom that's probably better than what Charlie would have come up with on his own. And I think in these anxious times, it is vital that we stay informed. And it is equally vital that we are seeking diverse perspectives to keep us informed. If you're getting your news solely from social media, you're probably not really getting very much actual news. If you're getting your news from one media outlet, you're not getting the full picture. So it's gotten hard, folks. I mean, we can't watch Walter Cronkite anymore. We've got to take information from multiple sources. Some of those sources are not even in the United States. I think one of the best is the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC. If you want news that's not laden with too much opinion, it's kind of hard to beat the BBC. The Economist magazine, available print and online, is also, I think, closer to home to Charlie, a great resource for insights and a world perspective. And there's good stuff here at home. And all I'm saying is a varied diet beats a single source diet. And in these anxious times where conspiracy theories and disinformation abound, it's really important that we all challenge ourselves to stay informed. Okay, enough preaching. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry that we had to do that, but it's very important. Just briefly, I want to, the election, that too shapes the environment that we're in. This map is ever so slightly out of date. The Republicans have picked up the Louisiana seat where there was a runoff. It was between two Republican candidates anyway. So 222 to 211, or is that 212? I can't see over there on my map. But with a couple of seats still in contention, one in southeastern Iowa and one in New York State, that are too close to call. The Iowa seat, 6 votes apart. So these things are going to probably be relitigated and everything else. Other than that, Democrats will continue to control the House. That all said, the GOP performed better than many expected on election day and night. And it is interesting when people are claiming widespread election shenanigans, that the GOP actually performed better both in the House and Senate than had been widely predicted. President Trump's outcome, less happy, but the GOP actually gained seats in the House, and Nancy Pelosi's margin is very narrow. So the Ds do still retain the House. We're already seeing the tensions between the very progressive wing of the party, as typified by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the centrist Democrats, including from Virginia, for example, Abigail Spanberger, who, when Congress was in lockdown the other day, was the first one warning people to take their congressional pins off because that was the easiest way for them to be identified by the intruders as members of Congress. She's a former CIA person, so her CIA training was kicking in. Senate, this map's also slightly out of date. It should be 48 Democrats and 2 independents that caucus with them. Georgia is a settled matter now. Georgia, the vote hasn't been certified, but it's been declared, and it's due to be certified before the 22nd. So we'll have an evenly divided Senate, which is interesting. We haven't seen that for a while. I think Dick Cheney was vice president the last time we saw that. So Democrats thought that they would gain a larger majority than they did. Obviously, it all came down to Georgia, which was hugely unprecedented. Lots of lessons to learn. I mean, first, just to have 2 Senate seats up in the same year in the first place, it was really unprecedented. But what this all means is that Democrats will set the agenda, Democrats will control committees on the floor, The vice president will hold a tie-breaking vote, which means she has to be there when she needs to be there to vote, or it doesn't matter. So that's not an absolute. She's not there all the time. It is important to know that the number of members on committees will be equal, and the budgets allocated to each party will be equal. So it will be, in a sense, a measure of power sharing, but with the Democrats setting the agenda. Normally in the Senate, it takes 60 votes on key procedural maneuvers. And so bipartisanship is the only way you get to 60 votes in a 50-50 Senate. There are on some policy measures that have fiscal aspects to them. There is a tool called budget reconciliation that may allow for significant legislating by a simple majority. Budget reconciliation is the tool that Republicans used to pass the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that they might talk about in a moment. Presidential, the dust has settled. The map has not changed. Joe Biden is scheduled to be inaugurated on the 20th next week. And so that will be what it will be. I think for both parties, there's some soul searching that needs to be happening as the dust settles. I think for Democrats, they underperformed with rural voters. They underperformed with working class voters. They are struggling, arguably, with economic and, in some cases, social issue messaging. And for Republicans, it's the question of are you gonna seek a bigger tent, and what will be the future of Trump or Trumpism? I'm not here to delve down into that any deeper than that, but I think both parties have some soul searching to do. I've kind of suggested this already, but the narrow margins that we see in both chambers will stifle extreme agendas, at least legislatively speaking, and they'll force moderation. They'll force moderation in cabinet choices. They'll force moderation in legislation. But there are other tools, and there's a lot that a new administration can do through regulation and through executive actions, as we have seen over the last 4 years. So things that can't be done legislatively, we're gonna be watching all three dynamics here. So Biden assembles his cabinet. Obviously, he is prizing diversity and experience. And I think from an experience perspective, that's probably mostly good news. These are folks who have done the job before. They're folks who know their way around. They know how the machinery works. They'll be able to hit the ground running. And with the pandemic being job 1, job 2, and job 3 for the new administration, a seasoned team will be important. We're watching a lot of appointments, but obviously 3 that we're watching closely. Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack served for 8 years under Obama, former Iowa governor, pretty well known, pretty safe pick. Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, we actually know him quite well. We worked very closely with him. He was deputy secretary in the last couple of years of the Obama administration. And we worked quite closely with him, and he's smart and he is extraordinarily talented. So that's a good thing. Labor, a little bit more of an open question. Boston Mayor Marty Walsh, close to the unions, very, very concerned about worker safety issues. But on the other hand, sort of a listen to all sides type approach. So hopefully we'll find that we can at least have a hearing with him and try to make our case. So down to the question of gridlock or progress, it's always easier in this space to bet on gridlocks. But if there is a silver in the narrow margins and in the terrible events that unfolded on the 37th of December, 2020, also known as January 6th, I think that it is possible that enough members see this as that it will be an inflection point, that they'll see it as a wake-up call. And so here is hoping. Top issues for us, pandemic response, that'll be the first thing that they're jumping back into. You know, frankly, our industry has been performing fairly well. So we're not the restaurant industry, for example, that's hemorrhaging. We have spent a lot of money in the industry trying to keep workers safe, PPE and distancing and re-engineering processes. So, we kind of hope that, maybe there's some recognition of relief for those types of things. Labor and immigration policy has been job one for a while, and I'll get into that in a moment. Tax policy, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I mean, Joe Biden in his platform called for raising taxes on high-income individuals and raising taxes somewhat, although, as I recall, not to levels that existed prior to the tax bill that passed during the Trump administration. So tax policy and cash accounting for growers, and these are things we're going to be watching. We're always doing a lot in the plant health and trade space, and sometimes we've got emerging issues there that are really, really problems. Gall on loropetalum, or crepe myrrh bark scale, or hibiscus budweevil. Lots of things coming at us that we're always behind the scenes working to leverage the tools and solutions that allow us to continue to grow and sell and install and maintain plants in healthy landscapes. And then finally, the environment, and some of the focus there will be on undoing things that the Trump administration did. I think there's going to be a lot of focus on climate change, and it's a double-edged sword for us. There may be some things that are beneficial for us ultimately, and there may be some things that are cost concerns. Ultimately, I'm a real optimist that the stuff we do, the plants we grow and sell and install and maintain, are a critical part of the solution to many of the environmental challenges that face us. And Charlie will probably talk about that some more when he gets into his value proposition. So it's not all bad on the environment piece. We could see some positives there. I want to talk just a little deeper on labor, and then really I'll just wrap it up, land the proverbial plane, and turn it over to Charlie. I think on the labor front, we're looking at volatility and uncertainty. The aid program, the seasonal program available to growers, it will continue to be available, but I think we're going to see a period of considerable volatility. Back in, I think it was November, the Trump administration published a new wage rule. That rule had some good features and some bad features, but as a general matter, growers regarded it as generally helpful in terms of providing wage relief. But on the 22nd, I think, Merry Christmas, of December, a federal judge blocked the rule, and it's probably not going to live to see the light of day, which means sometime probably before the beginning of March, we will have new adverse effect wage rates published, possibly some back pay liability for the period in between January 1 and when the new rule comes out. That's uncertain right now. But I think that we're going to see volatility on wage. And then there was a broader program rule, which might still get published in these waning days, but it would very likely get caught up in the new administration's regulatory freeze, which we expect. The first thing they'll do on the 21st is to put a freeze on everything that's not yet in effect, that the Trump administration has been attempting to do. H-2B, also uncertain. We're looking toward the April 1 season, and we of course have the 33,000 semi-annual cap on the number of admissions, and the requests filed through applications for labor cert from the Labor Department were over 96,000. So the demand is about 3 times the supply. The bit of good news is that Congress did extend in December for the rest of the fiscal year. They extended that discretionary authority that would allow the Homeland Security Secretary to release additional visas if he or she determines that U.S. employers are unable to fill their needs. I think it's a little more uncertain how that plays out in the context of high pandemic-related unemployment, but obviously the authority is there, and we'll be working very hard on that. The final thing to mention is that President Trump back in June put a ban on most foreign worker visa admissions. It did not affect H-2A, the ag program, but it did affect H-2B, H-1B, J-1s, various other visa classifications. Basically everything that's employment-based temporary visas, admissions were banned through December 31st. I think it was last week, the White House decided to extend that ban through March 31st, so it will still be in place. Now, there are limited exceptions for national interest and for food system related workers, and some H-2B workers, the national interest piece, some people are successful making the case around the economic necessity. But that's another piece that's going to be very, very uncertain. Hopefully Biden will rescind that ban, but it may just be in place until it airs at the end of March. And then finally, on the legislative front, I'm actually kind of optimistic. I believe that when you look at the range of issues that could get tackled on a bipartisan basis, I think there are some building blocks that are elements of immigration that could happen. I don't think comprehensive immigration reform will happen in this environment. I think that's too big and too heavy a lift with everything else going on. I think a solution that addresses the so-called dreamers in some way, a solution that addresses agricultural workers. We have a bipartisan package that passed in December 2019 with a broad bipartisan vote. That could simply be picked up and moved in the House again. The support, I think, is still there. And essential workers in the health sector are another area that's being talked about. So I think that there are some positive legislative possibilities. We're going to really have to work hard toward them. Just want to quickly mention, and Russell knows this well, he can be your Sherpa guide. I guess next time we can get face to Washington, but I cannot underestimate or understate, I cannot overstate how important the role of each of you is in building a relationship with your lawmakers, educating them on how our industry works, on the policy challenges we face, and advocating for reasonable, responsible solutions to move our industry forward and to allow us to succeed. Here's a picture of the last time we were able to convene. Everybody talks about storming the Hill, and I think after last week, we can't talk about storming the Hill anymore, but here we were peacefully assembling on the steps and entering the Capitol through the proper exits, through the airport style security to make our case to lawmakers. And the work is so incredibly important because at the end of the day, all politics are local and the political power resides in the constituents themselves. So we need you engaged, or our job is 15 times harder than it would be otherwise. So I wish we could take questions and answers, but given the givens, we're pre-recording, that's not going to be possible. But hopefully this was a little helpful. We certainly welcome feedback from you, and you can funnel that to Russell, or if you know me directly, you can get it directly to me. And with that, I will happily turn it over to my dear friend, Dr. Charlie Hall, although I think, Russell, you're probably going to introduce him.
Yeah, thanks so much, Craig, for joining us. Your insights are always appreciated. We are in a very politically divided state right now, and I appreciate your efforts to kind of present the facts in a nonpartisan way. With that being said, let's move on to our green industry outlook, our economic outlook with Dr. Charlie Hall. He grew up in the industry on a nursery in Western North Carolina. Although an economist by training, he is currently a professor in the Department of Horticultural Sciences at Texas A&M University, and also holder of the Ellison Chair in International Floriculture. His major areas of specialization include innovative management and marketing strategies, financial analysis, and benchmarking, and the situational outlook for nursery and greenhouse crops. Charlie, thanks so much for joining us today.
Absolutely, and thanks for the invite, Russell. I appreciate that. Let me start out by saying, hey, Craig, thanks very much. I appreciate your comments. Your 3 decades of experience on the Hill really shows, and your voice is not only one that is informative, but it's both reassuring at the same time. So I appreciate your commentary there, and well done. So let's talk, switch gears a little bit to the economy. Now, I selected this backdrop in terms of this title slide on purpose because, I mean, it's just a plethora of plant material here. And in spite of the woes of 2020, for our industry, this picture represents it quite well. and that folks were staying at home more. Obviously, they weren't traveling for personal reasons and business as much as what they had been previously. And they spent some of that time engaging in our industry. And we had several million newbies actually engaged in gardening and landscaping. And so the real question for 2021 is, are we going to be able to keep those newbies and keep the same level of activity among the gardening and landscaping consumers around the country? And so that the jury's still out. Hopefully by the time I finish today, we'll have a little bit of an answer there. I think I'm optimistic that we will have year-over-year growth again. 2020, depending on what part of the country you were located and whether or not you were deemed to be essential early on, impacted a lot of your profitability for the remainder of the year. But growers, it was about a 75%, 25% mix, with 75% being up year over year in terms of their comps. They were up anywhere from 5% to 25%. And heard some of the same types of things on the retail side. There's the Garden Center group, and Danny always shares information with me, and he's been gracious to continue doing that. And his numbers were up. Ian Baldwin's numbers up from his peer groups, and so I mean it was a good year on the retail side, and it's a good year on the landscape side. Jeffrey Scott and others that I converse with both agree. They had a good year on the landscape side. Many landscapers are backed up 4 to 6 months in terms of projects. So if Mother Nature will cooperate in 2021, I mean, the stage is set, and we're still sheltering in place to a great extent, even though after the Alabama game last night, I heard that McFarland Avenue was loaded with people and they weren't necessarily masking. But if we can get the vaccines in order and get people vaccinated, there is great hope that at least by the second quarter, the end of the second quarter, we can have folks vaccinated and then start turning a corner. But let me flip to the slide here. One basic premise is that the shape of the economic recovery is correlated with the shape of the COVID curve, and the curves have not been friendly to us. Just within the last 7 to 10 days, we've been averaging close to 4,000 deaths. And of course, the caseloads are increasing. So we have not turned the corner on this thing, but we do have great optimism because of the vaccines. And the most likely scenario is that by quarter 3 and quarter 4, we'll start seeing a turnaround and that curve will start moving in our favor. But we got to get the vaccines out there. We've got to make sure that we have the distribution and logistics handled in terms of getting the vaccines to people. And of course, overcome any vaccination hesitancy on the part of those anti-vaxxers and others. So we have a ways to go. And the good news is that we have at least a plan for President-elect Biden in order to put a lot of emphasis on this. Now, so we switch gears to the economy. Obviously, second quarter, oh my word, second quarter 2020, down 33% on an annualized basis. It's key point there that it's annualized basis. Third quarter, exactly opposite. We had a 31.4% increase in GDP on an annualized basis. Now, let me explain what I mean by annualized. That means that that decline 33% in the second quarter. If the next 3 quarters were to occur exactly the same for the year, it'd be 33%. So it wasn't an actual 33%. It was actually a 9% decrease from the first quarter of 2020, right? So second quarter declined 9%, which is still a big drop. Craig, we got a $22 trillion economy. You talk about 9% of 22 trillion. It takes you 36,000 years just to count to a trillion. You guys that listen, you don't believe me? Just try it. It'll take you 36,000 years to count to a trillion, assuming you count one number for every second, which you can't. Now, third quarter, that was a 7.4% increase. Now that's we're moving in the right direction. Now, the jury's still out on the fourth quarter, and the ranges, oh my word, there's such a variance. Craig alluded to that it's actually 23 blogs now, Craig, that I follow. And of course, there's a lot of modelers that I follow, the economic quant jocks, we call them. And the numbers range from 2% all the way to 13% in terms of fourth quarter performance. But I would say the median is around 3.5. And I would be in that category as well, that we're more likely going to see about a 3% growth in GDP in the fourth quarter of 2020. And then, of course, we'll see a little more muted growth in the first quarter, because we always see muted growth in the first quarter because it's daggone wintertime and it's snowing. It even snowed here in Texas this past week. And I made snow cream for the first time in years. And that's a North Carolina habit that I picked up when it would snow. We had 4 inches of snow here in College Station, so we knew that something was going on. Now, let me switch to jobs, because that's a big emphasis on in terms of the performance of the economy. You can see the claims for unemployment, both the initial claims and the continuing claims for unemployment. In other words, the initial claims captures all those people that initially filed for unemployment. Continuing claims captures those that continue on a month to month to month. And you can see that some of them were taking advantage of the pandemic unemployment assistance, and others, the pandemic emergency unemployment compensation. Both of those programs were in the CARES Act. They were eliminated on December 26th. There'll be a stopgap as part of the $900 billion stimulus package that was just passed by Congress. So we're still a long ways to go. We lost 22 million jobs. We're only about halfway back in terms of the jobs that we've hired back. Most of the middle to higher income families have been okay. It's been middle to lower income families that have been hit the hardest, because many of those, ironically, first responders and essential workers. And so lower income families have been hit a lot harder than anybody else. How that $900 billion divided, I got this graphic that breaks it down. Small business, there's $325 billion allocated towards PPP and other, or PPP 2.0 and other small business related programs. For workers, families, another $286 billion. And you can see that there's some money tagged for vaccination, transportation, the food assistance program from USDA. We've got some money back into that program, childcare, broadband internet, and so forth. That's how it breaks down right now. Big chunk of that going to schools, because that's a big priority from President-elect Biden, and get kids back to schools as quickly as possible. So that's how that money shakes out. With some of the money that's going to come from the next stimulus check, obviously people are going to spend a portion of that. They're going to save a portion of that. And we've seen all over the map in terms of retail sales that have been COVID winners and COVID losers in terms of retail sales. And you can see the sectors that have been hit hardest on the chin: restaurants, bars, etc. And the good news is that when you look at how people break down their spending, and this pie over here represents the spending that people make in terms of their household budget, we fall into recreation services and recreation goods over here on the good side. Now, this data, this chart on the left is actually from Yelp, and it was talking about the categories with the largest percent increase in consumer interest. And all those red arrows are sectors that are related to the green industry, right? So that's really good news, and that interest in terms of spending. Now, as I said before, the high wage workers, they are back in terms of employment. In fact, their employment levels have increased 1.2% since February 1 last year. However, low wage unemployment that's still down 19%. And you got the middle wage between 27,000 and 60,000. And that bar, if this line, if it's in here, it'd be right here in the middle. They're still down as well. So it's the tale of two cities. It's two different situations. There are some that are really hurting across this country because of COVID still. There are others, well, it's been bad in terms of minimizing their social life and everything, but it hasn't really hit them as hard. Now, in terms of lawn and garden consumers, fortunately, most of our folks fit up right in here, right? And that's hard to say. As an economist, when I'm looking at the income discrepancies that we have within the country and so forth, and we have big issues we got to cover, and yet at the same time, our customer base, a lot of them are doing okay. Therefore, they have the money to spend on lawn and garden products and lawn and garden services. Why is housing doing so well? Well, again, I spend a lot of time looking at housing, an inordinate amount of time looking at housing because our industry is correlated with housing. Those high wage workers, they're driving a lot of housing demand right now. We have a shortage of houses that are in the pipeline, right? We have less than, I think it's 1.8 months or less worth of houses in the pipeline. Mortgage rates are down, right? The Fed rate, they've lowered the rates ridiculously low, and they're going to keep those rates ridiculously low, by the way. It'll probably be 2022 before we see any significant increase in interest rates, at least until the COVID situation betters. And of course, the millennial wave is coming of age. And they got this graph up here on the left, and then you see this wave right here are the millennials. And the millennials are basically 25 to 40 years of age. So again, those 40-year-olds are driving some of this demand as well, because affordability is pretty good, even though home prices have been spiking. And we see this appreciation right here in terms of high home prices. And home prices are getting dangerously close to where they were prior to the Great Recession. And if you remember the Great Recession, even though it was a decade ago, if you remember, it was a financial crisis coupled with a bubble bursting in the housing market that really put the whammy on us. So that's the home prices. I'm keeping my eye on that. Housing starts, you can see the forecast. We're not forecast to slow down too much on housing. And that's good news for our industry because a lot of those houses need flower shrubs and trees. So we'll see how this forecast plays out. There's always black swan events that could put a kink in it, but so far, so good. As I mentioned, there have been certain sectors that have done well. Landscaping over here on the green side, right? Those businesses that have done actually pretty well relative to some of the businesses that have not done so well over here on the red side. Now, some high frequency indicators, Russell, this has little to do with our industry. It's just kind of cool to see the TSA check-ins, right? They were increasing, and then after the holidays have fallen off because, again, a lot of that travel, folks got sick with not social distancing, so that fell off again. And hotel occupancy is still not where it was, nor is the number of miles that we're driving and the amount we're spending on food away from home in restaurants. Now I'm close to bringing my talk to a crescendo here. You can see our real GDP growth ever since the Obama years, when Obama inherited the recession from George W. Bush. The first term, you can see the growth rate in real GDP. Second term Obama years, you can see the growth rate in real GDP, and then you can see the 4 years of the Trump administration, and then the pandemic. Man, as an economist, when I'm talking about statistics, I can fit a regression line through that really nicely. And that shows you, regardless of the administration, whether it was a Democrat or Republican administration, the growth rate through this time period is fairly constant. You didn't see a Trump bump. It's that growth rate is fairly constant until you got to the pandemic. And interestingly, when you go back to 1900 and look forward through time, Has the economy performed better under Democrat regimes or Republican regimes? Ironically, though Republicans are known as the party for business, the economy has actually performed better under the Democrat regimes. However, there are other factors besides partisanship that affect the economy. There's causality and there's correlation. That just happens to be pure correlation, right? That is not causality. So there's other things. I am more concerned with who's in charge of the Federal Reserve than I am who's in the White House. All right, so that tells you a little bit right there. Over here on the right, got this output gap. See that the pandemic hit us pretty hard, and this is our growth that we bounced back. And like I said, we didn't bounce back all the way. And this forecast right here, but we're not growing at the same rate we were. That's called an output gap. And right now, this is pretty substantial. So notice that matches up to this is my own chart. I did this in PowerPoint, and I was showing the initial bounce back. And I was saying, and I still contend that we're going to have slower growth until we get this health crisis under control. And the growth from there, whether it's steep or whether it's flat, is going to depend on the pent-up demand, the amount of business failures, and the policy dimensions that we put into place. And so a lot of the policies that Craig was talking about in terms of the Biden administration, those policies that have the most likelihood of passing are those that are going to be moderate and bipartisan. So we'll see how this plays out over time. The good news is that when you look at the leading economic index, and Russell, this is the one index, this is the first economic indicator I look at every month. It's this leading economic index that the Conference Board puts out. And because it's a foretelling of the economy, basically a year down the road. Right. And so if you look at that shape and how that's playing out, man, look at that. That matches up to am I good? Man, that matches up that curve almost perfectly. And so if I'm right, again, we don't know how quickly we're going to be recovering, but by third, fourth quarter, we should be turning a corner on this thing, provided we get the vaccines right. So green industry, what does it look like? We still have an undersupply of houses. Like I said, there's some pent up demand. It's driving housing prices up, but the demand's there. People are going to need flower shrubs and trees. Energy sector, it's a mixed bag, right? And I'm from Texas, and we do a lot with energy, and so I think oil prices are still going to be mitigated because of what's happening geopolitically in the world. We are going to have more business closures, and I don't know how many those are going to be. So that's a big question mark in terms of what impact that's going to have on the economy. There are going to be some supply chain issues. We saw that during COVID. We've not fixed all those. There's going to be more emphasis on B2B commerce, particularly all through the supply chain. And we're going to see, again, more emphasis on business consumer commerce. And that e-commerce is going to continue to be a factor, and we're going to see more plants sold that way. Excuse me. Shrink, labor, and working capital. That's still the big three for the industry. We can't forget about those things. Shrink went way down during during COVID because folks were growers, for example, they normally would slow down in June and July and so forth. And they were getting calls from garden centers. I need more plants. Well, we don't have what you've got. We've got some smaller, send it on, right? So a lot of the shrink that would normally occur through the supply chain was mitigated because of the strong demand. Labor, Craig talked about labor. We're still going to have labor availability and labor cost issues. So managing your working capital is still going to be critical. Make sure you got the cash flow, depending on how the vaccines pan out and how the spring actually pans out in terms of weather. There are going to be some higher operating costs from a worker safety standpoint and a customer safety standpoint. As I said, we've not turned this thing around on COVID yet. So we've got a little ways to go, and we're going to have to continue our SOPs that we put in place to operate successfully in the midst of COVID, we're going to have to continue those, and that adds a little bit of cost to our value chain. Now, there are going to be some rising healthcare premiums, and of course, President-elect Biden has talked about the healthcare a lot, and he basically wants to provide a public option within the Affordable Care Act, tweak the ACA, and make it better. And so that's probably one of the things he's going to talk about in the first 100 days of his administration. So we may see some rising healthcare costs, but they've been rising for 10 years anyway. And you guys experienced that firsthand. All right, so that's my stop share right there. Russell, that's it in a nutshell. So bottom line, I'm still optimistic, right, in terms of our industry. I think the stage is set that we may see a 5 to 10% year-over-year comp in terms of lawn and garden sales in 2021, spring 21. So I think as long as we don't mess it up somehow, or Mother Nature doesn't mess it up for us, I think we're going to see a pretty good spring. And so I've always been known to say you got to make hay when the hay's out there. So it's time to make hay.
All right. Well, Charlie, thank you so much for that. Always insightful. And Craig, we appreciate your presentation as well. I know we're all looking forward to a time where we can get back together in one room and listen to one of these presentations, sit next to our neighbor and have some good follow-up discussion about it. So thanks again for joining us. And on behalf of the Alabama Nursery Association, Nursery and Landscape Association, and our friends over in Mississippi and Louisiana, we hope all of you will make plans to be at the Gulf States Horticultural Expo next January 20th and 21st of 2022. We are planning that event, and hopefully we'll get this pandemic under control and look forward to seeing everybody down there. Thanks so much, y'all, and have a great day.